All right. Well, I've had several people actually ask for more information about strategy in internal audit. So I'm going to do several videos that talk about that. And this is the first one that's kind of about some strategy basics for internal audit. Now, I know some of you that may be listening may be thinking, strategy, what do I need strategy for an internal audit? I just need to go do some projects. I do a risk assessment, I go do projects, right? Well, wrong in a lot of ways. So it's important to have a strategy, and especially if you are the chief audit executive or an audit leader, you should be thinking about strategy, because without strategy, it's like going into battle without a plan, or it's like cutting down trees without taking time to sharpen your saw. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about those here in just a minute. Talk about some basics related to strategy, because again, a lot of people don't actually understand it, and talk about some ways in which you can start to think about internal audit more strategically. Okay, now, why am I talking about this? Because in a recent report that I read that was based on a survey, between 40 to 50% of people in internal audit say strategic planning isn't critical enough to displace other responsibilities, which I do not agree with. Okay. And what that's telling me is that probably at least half of the internal audit groups that are out there are just busy doing the tactics and are ignoring any sort of a strategic view on what they're doing. Now, that seems fine for getting things done, but there's a lot of problems with it. Okay, and I'll share this little story to kind of help start explaining it. So you may have heard a story that Stephen Covey used to tell all the time about sharpening the saw. So in his book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, one of the 7 habits that he talked about was called sharpening your saw. And sharpening your saw, the idea is taking time to, stop, pause, do a little self-work, a little self-care, so that you can keep going. Because without doing that, we end up burning ourselves out. We end up without doing a check-in every so often. We find out that we've been maybe working on the wrong things. Our ladder is leaned up against the wrong building, as an example. And so the story kind of goes like this. There were these 2 lumberjacks. So a lumberjack is a person who cuts down trees for a living. And they still exist, right? A lot of machines are doing stuff now. But in the old days, lumberjacks used to use saws. And actually I think he's technically my great uncle. I think so. Great uncle was a logger in the Pacific Northwest in Oregon and Washington. So he used a chainsaw because it was back in the 50s to cut down trees. But before that, they used hand saws. Okay. And a hand saw, if you've ever used a hand saw, after a while it gets dull. And so the way the story goes is there were these 2 lumberjacks that were having a competition on who could cut down the most trees in a certain period of time. Okay. So they start off, people watching, everything is great. Who's the best lumberjack who can cut down the most trees in the shortest amount of time. So they get ready, get set, somebody shoots off a gun or does something and says, go, right? And so both the lumberjacks go out, they start sawing trees, cutting them down, boom, 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 right? They're going along and they're staying pretty even paced, right? They're both cutting down about the same amount of trees. And all of a sudden, one of the lumberjacks stops, sits down, pulls out his file, and starts sharpening his saw. And everybody else that's there is like, what are you doing? The other person is getting ahead, right? Why are you just sitting on your butt sharpening your saw. You should be sawing down trees like the other guy. And the lumberjack said, don't worry, right? You're gonna see why I'm doing this. So he sits down, he sharpens his saw, he gets back up and starts cutting again. Now this goes on, right? So it seems like the one is getting further ahead. The one stops, sharpens his saw, and then he continues. And eventually, at the end of it, who do you think wins the race? The person who stopped to sharpen his saw. Why? Because he was more efficient at cutting down the trees. And so eventually, the person who never stopped, who was just doing, cutting down the trees, eventually what happened is their saw became so dull that it took more and more effort for them to cut down trees. And eventually the person with the sharp saw cut down more trees. Even though it seemed like he wasn't as busy, right? Because he would stop and sit and sharpen his saw, to other people, it looked like he wasn't actually doing the work. But sharpening the saw is doing the work. So how does this come into strategy? Well, as I said, 40 to 50% of people think that doing regular audit projects or being busy doing other things is more important. So they're like the person who doesn't stop to sharpen their saw. They just keep going in the tactics, going. And what happens? Eventually, they start to get burned out. It takes more effort to do little things. And eventually, they're no longer effective or efficient at what they're doing. So this is very similar in internal audit. If you're so busy that you're not taking time to stop, to think strategically, to sharpen your saw, to check back in, where you are in your strategy, then you're like the first person. And what I've seen from coaching many chief audit executives over many years, those who are most successful are those who follow a strategic plan. Those who stop to take time each month to think strategically and to actually, maybe adjust the things that they're doing if they're not meeting their objectives the way they expected. Okay. And again, there's different ways to do that, to stop and think strategically. One of those is the Audit Leader Forum that I run. It's an opportunity for audit leaders to stop, take a few hours out of a month, to stop twice a month and actually think strategically. Get, information from other people, bounce ideas off of other people, ask questions, if you're struggling or having challenges in certain areas, so that you can actually do things strategically. So strategy is very important in internal audit. Even though most of you may not believe it is, you may not have been taught that it is, it actually is very important. And so again, think, if you're going into battle, strategy is a word that is used in the military. So imagine again, you see a whole bunch of enemies out there and you're like, all right, everybody, grab your swords, grab your guns, let's go. Well, leader, what's our plan? I don't know. We're just going to go attack, right? We're just going to go attack. Well, you're probably not going to be very successful if that's how you choose to go. It's better for you to stop and have a plan, right? And then check in with the plan to make sure that it's working. So let's talk a little bit about strategy and what it actually is. And again, I know some of you that are listening to this video might be saying, I got it. I already know what strategy is. Well, if you already know what it is, then why aren't you doing it? And I would question if you actually really understand it, because the way a lot of people talk about it, they're not talking about strategy when they're talking about and using the word strategy. Okay. Now, how do I know this? Because again, I work with executives. In fact, a little while ago, I was at a risk management conference with chief risk officers. In one of the breakout sessions, we were talking about strategy. And I was floored at how many people in the audience, and there were quite a few people in the audience, when we started talking about strategy and the person who was leading the discussion was asking some questions, dead silence. Simple questions like, well, if you have a strategic plan, what time horizon should that be on? Nobody knew the answer, or else nobody was willing to say anything about it, right? Well, what does the word strategy actually mean? Again, silence, right? So I thought it would be good to talk here on this video about some of the basics of strategy. And I'm going to start, talking about how this applies more to internal audit, some of the ways that this can be. But let's just talk about strategy in general, what it actually is, why you have it. Okay. Now, to start with, it makes no sense to have a strategy unless there is a particular objective that you are trying to accomplish. Okay. So the order goes like this. You have objectives, you create strategies in order to achieve those objectives, you create tactics, plans, controls, whatever you want to call them, for how you're going to implement that strategy. Okay? So it goes objectives, strategy, tactics. Objectives, strategy, tactics. Okay, so what does this look like? Because again, most of the time when people are talking about strategy, they're actually talking about tactics. They're not talking about strategy. They've ignored or often ignore the objectives and strategy side of it and just jump right into the tactics. And again, that's just like going into battle and saying, pick up your guns and swords, let's go, right? Without ever having a plan. So how could this look like? And so, one example that I've come up with that I used in my certified risk-based internal auditor training, and I've taught this to thousands of people all over the world, as it relates to risk management, as it relates to risk-based internal auditing, because their objectives and strategy are important, so you can really understand what the true risks are and rewards are to the organization, so you know where to focus your efforts. So if you don't understand these things, it's hard for you to do risk-based internal audit, which again, maybe is one of the reasons why so many people think they're doing it or are not really doing it, but are saying that they're doing it because they're skipping over strategy because they just don't understand it. So let's talk basically about it. And again, this is an example that I have used for many years to try to explain this concept to people. So first off, let's assume that we are in a company or organization. I'm going to say company because we're talking about revenue, so it's probably a for-profit company. And our overarching or strategic objective that we're trying to accomplish is we want to increase sales by 20% next year. That's our objective. We want to increase sales by 20%. Okay, great, right? That's our objective. Now we have to start thinking about how are we going to do that? How are we going to raise revenue by 20% this next year? Well, you have several different options for doing that. You have several different strategic options for you to do that. Now, one might be, I'm going to raise my prices by 20%, right? So if I sell the same amount that I did last year in volume, but I charge 20% more than I did the year before, that's going to give me a 20% increase in revenue. So that could be a strategy. You could say, look, our strategy is to increase the prices or to be seen as a premium provider of things. Okay. And so that could be your strategy. Now, if that's your strategy, obviously there are tactics that you would need to use in order to do that. You'd have to actually go and change the prices on your website. You'd have to, maybe start doing some marketing a little bit different to explain why your product is worth 20% more than what other people are paying, right? So those are some of the tactics that you would come into. And that's where really your opportunities and threats, risks and rewards start coming into play, right? Because if that's what you choose to do, a threat is, hey, people are going to see that you're charging 20% more than everybody else. So there's a threat that they may choose to go with somebody else who's a lower price. And so you have to overcome that threat, overcome the risk or the effect of that threat by maybe educating people more to why your product is better and worth 20% more, right? See, that's where this starts going. Just got a comment through here too. So again, if you're on with me live, go ahead and put comments in. YT says, pretty fun video you made yesterday. Saw it on YouTube, trying to understand. Yeah. So anyway, so here we go. So let's same scenario, but let's now use a different strategy. So again, our objective has not changed. The objective is increase sales by 20%. What other strategies could we take? Well, we could instead choose to be a low cost provider. So we could sell for less money than everybody else. We could choose to lower our prices, right? That could be the strategy that we choose to take. Now, if we choose to take that strategy, are there risks and threats associated with that? Yes. Because what if we lower our price and we sell the same amount that we did last year? Maybe we're going to have 20% lower sales, right? Instead of more. So again, there would have to be things that we're doing, right, in our tactic perspective in order to be able to get more volume. Because if we lower our prices, we have to get more volume, right, in order for us to be able to increase our sales by 20%. So some of the tactics might mean, hey, maybe we need to spend more on marketing, or maybe we need to hire more salespeople. Also looking at it, if you're going to be selling more units, maybe you have to increase your production capacity, as an example, right? Those are all things that you may need to do or include in your tactics. Now, again, you can see how the opportunities and threats, risks and rewards associated with that different strategy of being a low-cost provider are different than if you raise your price by 20%. Okay. What else could we do? Well, another strategy is we could keep our prices the same. We could plan to, just hold them where they are, but we want to increase the volume at the same price. So again, that could be your strategy of how you're going to choose to do it. Now, if you do that, obviously, maybe you're going to have to do some more marketing. Maybe you have to hire more salespeople because you're worried about getting the volume up, right? So that's another option. But again, see how those are all different. Your objective has never changed. The objective never changed, but because your strategy changes, right, your opportunities and threats, risks and rewards are different under each strategy. What are some other things we could do? Well, we could choose to start selling in a different country. Maybe we go into a different market, right? That could be a way for us to increase our sales. Maybe we haven't sold in Germany, or we haven't sold in Japan, or we haven't sold, we have no presence in Africa, let's say. And so maybe the strategy is to open and start selling product in a different geographic region. That's the strategy that we choose to take. Now, again, there would be a whole bunch of tactics and things that you would need to do in order to achieve that strategy, which again is going to help you achieve your objective. Remember, the objective is the important thing at the end of the day. So those could be some things that you could do. And again, the opportunities, threats, risks, and rewards are going to be different under that strategy than they would in something else. Now, as just a crazy idea, you could start choosing to sell drugs for your company, or you could start a hard money lending service, right? You could start something completely different in order to help you get more revenue. You could start a casino, okay? Now, none of those things may be in the standard line of what you do, but there's strategies you could choose to take. And again, all of those strategies would be different. There'd be different tactics. There'd be different opportunities, threats, risks, and rewards associated with those different strategies as well. So that's a little basic about strategy, right? Where again, it's the plan in which it's going to help you to achieve your objective. And so again, think about it in a general, sense of, how companies choose to present themselves is based on their strategy. So companies like Walmart that like to be the low cost leader, right? They pride themselves in having lower prices than everybody else, right? That's their strategy. That's their strategy. And based on that strategy, there's certain opportunities, threats, risks, and rewards that go along with it. Other companies like, Louis Vuitton choose to be seen as a premium provider. They charge a lot more money. They have higher quality goods, but are their goods commensurate with the difference in which they charge? I don't know. That's for everybody to decide on their own, right? But obviously, they spend money on marketing, on celebrity endorsements, other things like that, in order to help them sell their products for more money. Okay. So that's a little bit about strategy. And again, I know I'm kind of running out of time for today, so I'm going to kind of wrap it up, but I just wanted to share some basics, right, about strategy before we get too far into the rest of things. Because again, it's important for internal audit to have a strategy, to use a strategy, to check back in on the strategy. So you can start thinking about, before the next video, start thinking about what are some of the objectives that internal audit has? What are the objectives? And again, if you're a senior or a staff person, maybe you don't know, what it is for your organization. But if you're an audit leader, if you're a chief audit executive, you probably should know what those objectives are. You should have objectives. And the objective shouldn't just be complete the audit plan on time and on budget, right? That's not enough. Completing the audit plan on time and on budget is not a strategy. It's not even that good of an objective. That's a duh. That's part of just doing business as an internal auditor. But think about what are some of the other objectives that you may have. Do you want to be seen as a trusted advisor? Do you want to be included in more of the decisions, right? What's the mix of assurance versus advisory work that you want to do? Some of those kind of things to start thinking about what really are the objectives that your internal audit group has. Because before you're clear on that, it doesn't really do you much good to get into the strategy. So I would encourage you to think a little bit about some of the objectives that you may have. And we're going to pick that up and talk a little bit more about some internal audit objectives and maybe some different strategies or ways in which you can do that in this next video. So with that, I'm going to sign off for today, and I'll see you on the next video.